Well, that last talk was great, and it's really important, the good work that's going on trying to reduce the lead problem in Flint, and I think hopefully this talk will build on this. Let's see, so is there a way I can see what slide is being shown? Okay, so my story begins here in my freshman chemistry lab at Reed College. My freshman chemistry professor at the time was 23 and had a PhD from MIT, which was pretty unusual in the 60s. And she thought chemistry was the coolest subject on the planet. How many of you think chemistry is the coolest subject on the planet? Okay, a few of you. And so there were 4 girls in my freshman chemistry class, and all of us went on and got doctorates in chemistry, which says something about the importance of role models. And I think everyone in this room can be a role model to young women. My lab partner was a handsome young man from Portland. He said, "Do you want to go climbing?" And he's very handsome, so I said, "Sure." And we started climbing above Timberline Lodge. I was from Chicago. I started gasping, but he was very handsome, so I kept gasping, and I reached the snow. It was the most beautiful place I had ever been, and I fell in love with mountain climbing and chemistry. And my life was an alternation between the two. When I passed my qualifying exams at Berkeley in chemistry, I heard of an expedition to Denali, the highest mountain in North America, and I applied, and I got a brochure saying women could go as far as base camp to help with the cooking, but they were not allowed on the climb. So I organized my own expedition, 6 women, and we all reached the summit of McKinley, which and so for me, that was the beginning of realizing that you can have an impossible dream and make it happen by persistence. So I kept alternating between chemistry and mountain climbing. And on a high mountain in India, one of our climbers fell through a cornice to his death. And he was America's young leading rock climber and a very ecological rock climber. He pioneered not driving pitons into the cliffs in Yosemite, but using clean climbing with chalks. And after he died, I was depressed. He was like my boyfriend, and I was a postdoc at the Stanford Medical School there in biochemistry, studying how proteins fold. And I wanted to do something for the environment that made a difference in his memory. And so I went to see a guy named Bruce Ames, if any of you have heard of the Ames Test. He was on my thesis committee when I got my doctorate at Berkeley, and I said, "I want to do something to make the world a better place." And he said, "Well, you know, we have this problem about flame retardants in kids' pajamas, and nobody wants to work on it, even the undergraduates. It's just too applied. But you know, there are these flame retardants, I think they're really toxic. They're 10% of the weight of the pajamas that most kids are wearing in America. I think they might get into the kids, and they might be cancer-causing." And this sounded so bizarre to me, flame retardants, but I was depressed. I wanted to do something. I'm like, sure. So we found a little girl who'd never worn pajamas with flame retardants. Her mom had bought her pajamas in England, where they didn't use them. And we put the little girl in the flame-retarded pajamas, collected her urine, and the next morning, after one day, her urine contained breakdown products in the flame retardant, and they were molecules known to be cancer-causing. So I went, oh my goodness. So then we did a study to see if this flame retardant, it's the Ames Test, does a chemical cause mutations in bacteria? If it does, it's likely to cause cancer. We ran an Ames test, and this chemical called tris was one of the strongest chemicals we'd ever seen in causing mutations in bacteria. And we suddenly realized that virtually all the children in America wearing pajamas that were 10% by weight a cancer-causing chemical that got into the children. So I wanted to write a paper, tell the parents of America, and then I got invited to this mountain. Do you know what mountain this is? No, it's Mount Everest. It's the highest mountain, as you know, in the world. At that point, it had only been climbed once by Americans. No American woman ever had a chance to even climb Annapurna. And I had this terrible decision. Did I go try to climb Mount Everest, or did I write the paper about the toxic pajamas? So how many of you would have gone to Mount Everest? How many of you would have wrote about the toxic pajamas? So I did both. And as I was climbing in the beautiful Kumbh icefall and going across teetery ladders across crevasses, I'd get to camp at night and I'd write my paper. And so day after day, I carried loads during the day, wrote my paper at night, and this is my high point. And you can see there's the Petri dish with no tris, not too many colonies, and there's the one with tris, lots and lots of mutations. So that was about 24/5 on Everest, and I sent my paper back by mail runner to Kathmandu, and it got back to Science and got published in Science magazine, and it was a big lead article in Science. And the title, it says something about our institute. It says, the main flame retardant in children's pajamas is a mutagen and should not be used. Now, for those of you who read scientific papers, I'm sure you all do, what do they always recommend as the next step? More research. Does anybody do a couple experiments and say that a chemical used in every kid's pajamas in the country shouldn't be used? Do you see that happening? So that's what we try to do at the Green Science Policy Institute, is we take good peer-reviewed science and we use it to affect change in the public interest. And I'm going to be talking today mostly about some of our science, what we've learned, and I think it's information that the medical profession does not have as much as you could. And so I'm hoping after this you're all going to sign up for our mailing list and hear from me once a month to stay up with this important information. So there you know what I want already. So we wrote this paper in January 1977. Does anybody here, have anybody heard about this, the tris pajamas? Yeah, people have. And 3 months later, tris was banned from kids' pajamas. And that's how things should be, right? You write a paper, you do communication, you do media, things change. And this was back before the chemical industry had quite worked out their strategies, I have to say. So tris was banned, brominated tris was banned, but the fact is that changing industrial processes is really expensive. So I remember after tris was banned, about 6 months later, I went to Penny's and I bought 30 pairs of pajamas in all different sizes, and the lady at Penny's said, "Boy, you must have a really big family." And I felt like a super spy, and I took little pieces from the fabric seams of all the pajamas because I thought I could give them to my friends with kids, and extracted them, and it turned out that only about 20% still had that old bad bromated tris, but most of the rest had chlorinated tris. Virtually the same, what's called the regrettable substitute. And it makes sense. So then we wrote another paper in Science, and chlorinated tris was removed from use. And I really thought the problem was taken care of. But what I didn't know is that chlorinated tris had only been removed from use in pajamas and was being used a lot of other places. But I didn't know that. I went on mountain climbing. I led the first American ascent of Annapurna 1, which is considered the most dangerous of all the world's 8,000-meter peaks. It has the highest fatality rate, and it was with an all-women's team, and I'm not going to take the time to tell that story now. My book, Annapurna, Woman's Place, tells it, and I'll be signing books if people are interested later. And then I spent a long time writing a book called Breaking Trail, which is a really personal book about how my own really very challenging, dysfunctional childhood gave me the strength to lead the Annapurna expedition. And I feel like what I'm doing now is way harder and more important than climbing Annapurna, which is the most dangerous of all the world's high mountains. So I'll give you an idea it's how challenging it is. So what am I doing now? Well, this is a slide from my good friend Miriam Diamond, who's here with me. And it's about the fact that our world is filling with toxic chemicals, chemicals that never break down for a million years, that pollute everything, that do not help the health of anything. Someone did a study where all the honeys in the world have a toxic flame retardant, and that means all the bees in the world do. And it may not be the reason for the crash of the bees, but it's not helping their health. You know, and all the amphibians and all the endangered animals have these toxic chemicals, and our children and us. And in most cases, They're only there to make a profit for the chemical industry. So that is the message that we have been giving now, and it's all based on really good science. So in Europe, there's a lot of talk of transition to a green economy where things, instead of manufacturing things, using them and throwing them away, there's no way and there's a limited amount of resources on this planet. Let's have a circular economy where we design things so they can be used and reused. But once you put toxic chemicals in a product, you don't want to reuse it. You're back in that linear economy. In the US, we have one law about toxic chemicals. Oops. We have one law about toxic chemicals before they go out into the world. There's a Clean Air Act, a Clean Water Act, but once things are out in our air and our water, it's really hard to bring them back. So when this law was passed, it's called TSCA, the chemicals then, 62,000 previous chemicals were grandfathered. That means they're fine. And asbestos, which causes 10,000 deaths a year, the EPA cannot regulate. The standard of proof is so high that they tried for years to regulate asbestos, could not succeed, and don't even try to regulate these 62,000 chemicals. So what that means is, I'm just curious if people know this. How many of you, before you heard me start talking, thought that if a chemical was in your couch or your jacket or your shampoo, that somebody was making sure it was safe for your health? How many of you thought that? Okay, most people. So the answer is, those things have these 62,000 chemicals, and the EPA can know that they're as bad as asbestos, and they can't do anything. New chemicals, there is no requirement for data. 85% of new chemicals have no health data, and 67% have no data at all. And then the EPA has 6 weeks to show harm with no data. If they can show harm, then the industry can do all these tests, but while they're doing the tests, they're selling the chemicals to pay for the tests, and once they're selling the chemicals, they're not going to stop. So TSCA has been being reformed. Very recently, it's very unclear what's going to happen. But the situation is there are many, many extremely harmful chemicals that cause cancer, all these health effects in everyday products. A lot of people know about it, and nobody has the authority to do anything. So everybody's looking depressed, but me. Because there are things we can do, and that's what my talk is going to be about. And you as doctors, once you understand this, can do a lot to help keep your patients healthier. But right now, Herb Needleman and Phil Landrigan, two very famous pediatricians, said we're conducting a massive clinical toxicological trial, and our children and our children's children are the experimental subjects, because those chemicals are out in the world, they're in everyone, and especially in children. The regrettable substitution problem, I mentioned brominated tris went to chlorinated tris. On the left, you see a flame retardant called decabromo diphenyl ether, 10 bromines, 2 phenyl rings, an ether bond, very high volume. 20% of the weight of most of your televisions is probably this chemical. And by the way, there's no need for it. It's just there because it's there. It's persistent, bioaccumulate toxic. The more TV viewers in the house, the more there is in your dust. It finally has been phased out after a decade of work, and the substitute is decabromo diphenyl ethane on the right, which has the same properties. So that's the regrettable substitution problem. So a group of us, people who really cared about this issue and understood it, this is a field called environmental health. Anybody here in environmental health? Good. We decided to think about what we could do to really reduce the use of chemicals that are known to be extremely harmful, that are in everyday products, that end up in all of us. And so we had a retreat, we looked at the chemicals, and we realized there's certain classes or families where the whole family is harmful. And instead of spending 10 years banning the ether, and then 10 more years on the ethane, and then 10 more years on the next, that you could say, we don't want this whole class of chemicals. And one way of thinking is evaluating tens of thousands of individual chemicals. There's said to be, 100,000 chemicals out there is not workable, But if you put them in classes, and we have 6 classes, and you imagine the students who did this thought this was a fun slide to make. 6 classes is manageable. So I'm going to tell you about some of the classes to give you some examples of things you can understand and maybe do something about. So the 6 classes, and we'll go over the first 3 more, are highly fluorinated chemicals. These are stain and water repellents. They're my big favorite because they're the worst. Do people realize that? Okay, you will soon. Chlorinated antimicrobials, triclosan and triclocarban, you've probably heard something about them, perhaps. Flame retardants, bisphenols and phthalates, organic solvents, and certain metals. And when a chemical is in these classes, the question is this use really necessary? And is it worth it? If you say to a mom, you can have a perfectly stain-repellent carpet, but the chemical is one that is cancer-causing, will end up in your child, stay there for 20 or 30 years, stay on the planet forever, do you think that mom is going to think it's worth it to have that stain-repellent carpet if she has that information? And if you really want that stain-repellent carpet, is there a safer alternative? Invest in green chemistry. We think the use of these 6 classes can be reduced by 50% in 5 years by educating the people who are decision makers. We work with retailers, manufacturers, big purchasers, people who make decisions about chemicals. It's hard for consumers to do this. We think physicians can really help. We right now have 15-minute webinars on the 6 classes. If you go to 6classes.org, you can watch a 15-minute webinar and learn about them. We are going to be launching on June 22nd 3-minute webinars. Facebook, which is one of the companies, we have a buyers club of all these big companies and Harvard and the San Francisco Department of the Environment who are using their cumulative purchasing power to move the market towards healthier chemicals. And Facebook said, we want our designers to understand the 6 classes, but 15 minutes is too long. We want 3-minute videos. So we have been working for 2 years, and we are going to launch on June 22nd our 3-minute videos. So in 3 minutes, people can learn about each of the classes. 3 minutes each. You can't do them all in 3 minutes. So again, if you give me your card or sign up, I'm in that room where you sell books, with some books, but if you sign the mailing list, you'll hear from us once a month, and we'll invite you to our launch. So classes 1 to 3, these are halogens. And halogens are carbon, bromine, or fluorine bonded to carbon. And there are no naturally occurring halogens in any mammalian system. So that means cellular defense systems don't recognize the halogens, so the things that keep the cellular bouncers, the halogens go right into our cells, and then the cellular detoxifiers that throw out the toxics don't recognize them either. So that, like, remember the baby on the carpet, it goes into the body and it stays. So highly fluorinated chemicals. The carbon-fluorine bond strength is the strongest in the periodic table. So these chemicals make things oil and water repellent, a good thing, but they never break down. They last for geologic times, 1 million years. So you've got your nice Gore-Tex jacket, but that chemical is going to be around for 1 million years. These chemicals are in the bodies of 98% of Americans, and there's significant human data that they cause 2 kinds of cancer, elevated cholesterol, and a series of obesity, immune suppression, endocrine disruption. These are the sorts of products where you find them. We're working a lot now on food contact materials. So we discovered our buyers club that most of their cafeterias, the takeout boxes, the plates, microwave popcorn is classic. It's hot oil, so all microwave popcorn bags in America on the inside have these chemicals. However, in Denmark, where they banned them, there were big headlines, no more microwave popcorn, and then 6 months later there was an innovation, and they have them without the chemicals. And then new headlines, microwave popcorn is back. And so we're the company that makes the Danish ones. I just introduced them to Costco, because we analyzed stuff, and Costco said, oh my goodness. But it's all the microwave popcorn bags. A lot of outdoor gear, a lot of cosmetics. Again, if you go to the webinar, you'll get more suggestions about where they're used. But once you know where they are, you can reduce your exposure to these chemicals. People really didn't know about these. Unfortunately, the manufacturers have a loud voice saying they're all fine. The certain ones were phased out in 2015 that really are bad, where we know they're bad, but there are about 200 substitutes that are probably equally bad, but there's no data. So we got together 200 scientists at a big meeting in Madrid, and we made a statement calling on the international community to reduce the use of all of them. And so then reporters we tried to do a lot of media around that. It was the first time there was national media around these chemicals, and reporters could say, well, DuPont says the new chemicals are great, but 230 scientists are concerned. You know, you can have a voice with a consensus statement. So anyway, these are some of the articles, but a lot of our strategy is to bring together scientists, write a consensus statement based on peer-reviewed science, do a lot of media. After our media, the EPA set a health advisory water for drinking. Back in 2009, they set a one-time level of 400 parts per trillion, and there were a number of communities like Hoosick Falls in New York that were above that. And after all our publicity, the governor of New York demanded the EPA set a level. They set a level of 70 parts per trillion. And suddenly, 6 million Americans drinking water is above that. So that's like the lead problem. And these 6 million Americans know about it, and they're very unhappy. They're getting better drinking water, but they want to know what are the levels in their bodies. What should they do about it? Based on this work and the publicity, a lot of the pollution comes from firefighting foams, which are made of these chemicals, and they're used in practices with thousands of gallons just dumped into rivers, lakes, and oceans, and they make their way into groundwater. So the Air Force is actually stopping using them in training. However, they are moving to the bad alternatives. And so we're really working with the military and with product manufacturers, like the carpet industry is moving from the old bad ones to the new bad ones and saying they're fine. So a lot of what we're doing is putting out the word that you have to move away from the whole class. You can't go from one to the next. We did a paper in February that got a lot of publicity where we looked at fast food packaging and found about a third of it contained these chemicals. And people in the Senate wrote the companies and asked them to do things about it. So people in the Senate who can't do legislation are actually happy for opportunities like this. They're always asking for ideas of things they can do without legislation, and this is an example, is to write these companies, because 2/3 of the fast food wrapping did not have the chemicals, which means it's not needed, that they're better and safer alternatives. California Biomonitoring has listed the whole class, all 3,000, as chemicals of concern, so now they're on a government list, and we think it's really important. The outdoor industry, the clothing industry, they've all moved from the old ones to the new ones, and we want them to move away from all of them. All these brands have. We worked a lot with IKEA. IKEA first removed them from all their products worldwide. Crate & Barrel did. If you go to Crate & Barrel and you say, I want a stain-repellent chair or couch, they'll say, we don't sell that because it's toxic. Do we need this function given the potential for harm? And all these companies are saying we don't need it. H&M. The second class, so that's the good news. The second class, antimicrobials. So how many of you heard about the FDA ban of triclosan and triclocarban? How many people know about that? Okay, good. So triclosan and triclocarban are antimicrobials used in soap and about 1,000 other products. And in most cases, there's no benefit and a serious potential for harm. If you look at the structures, they look a lot like dioxin. They have a wide range of health effects, things that kill bacteria. When you wash them, to really make them, first of all, soap and water is the best way to wash, where they're used. Here's a list of places they're used. And now alcohol's fine, Colgate Total Toothpaste still uses them. If you look at it, it's like 0.3% triclosan. It's the one brand. And if you have gingivitis, if you have gum disease, they're helpful. So it's worth it if you have gum disease, but children and everyone else should not be using them. If you look at your Colgate Total, it's there. And so Soap and water work just as well as antimicrobials. For them to even work, you have to wash your hands for 1.5 minutes, which nobody does. So they go down into the wash water, and they're persistent, and they're toxic to aquatic organisms. And they end up in sewage sludge, which gets spread on fields, which ends up in our food. Someone did a study where 97% of women's breast milk have some level of antimicrobials. That's not a place where you want antimicrobials. And we didn't need them in the first place. There's no benefit. Now, alcohol's fine. So Purell is just alcohol. It's not an antimicrobial. Purell is fine, not, as far as I know. I mean, I'm not an expert on Purell, but it's not one of these. But it was triclosan and triclocarban that were the problems. We have a statement documenting the environmental and human health concerns, which is going to come out May 1st in Environmental Health Perspective, signed by 200 scientists, and we're going to do a lot of media. So hopefully you'll all hear more about this on May 1st and thereabouts. And meanwhile, the FDA has made a rule. They started working on their rule in 1974. They started writing a report saying that these chemicals had no benefit and a huge potential for harm, because you think of it, something that attacks bacteria that ends up in water and sewage sludge and our food supply is a problem. It took them from 1974 to 2016, and their rule says that over-the-counter soaps containing triclosan, triclocarban can no longer be sold, and actually 14 other antimicrobials. But unfortunately, when I went to the pharmacy to check on this, there was no triclosan and triclocarban, but there were quaternary ammonium salts, which are potentially quite harmful and we don't know much about instead. So again, we get rid of one toxic after 42 years and we move to the next. And I have to say, in contrast, when we did, you know, those webinars I told you about, the 15-minute webinars they were on, we played them in 2013 with scientists talking. After we did the one on antimicrobials, Target called us and they said, we had no idea we have this in our personal care line and we're taking them out immediately. And they took them out immediately. So companies can move the market. It's really hard for government. It's not like the FDA isn't doing the best they can, but industry is lobbying. It's a huge, huge battle. The third class, I don't know how I'm doing for time. 4 minutes, oh dear. Okay. The third class is flame retardants, and we've done a lot of work around a flammability standard in California. Do people know that almost all the furniture in America until 2 years ago, the foam was 5% by weight, a toxic flame retardant that did not provide a fire safety benefit, that was continually coming out of products into dust and ending up, you get dust on your hands, and children have anywhere from 3 to 100 times higher levels than their parents because they crawl in the dust and they put their hands in their mouths. And I won't take the time now. There are a lot of epi studies showing a lot of human health harm and thousands of animal studies. But till we came on the scene, the decision makers didn't know about all that science. So we took the science, we shared it with decision makers. We found there was no fire safety benefit. I don't have the time to explain now, but I can explain later, or you can look on our website, greensciencepolicy.org. We signed a statement, again, with 200 scientists. The Chicago Tribune wrote an amazing series. The subtitle says it all. A divisive campaign by industry brought toxic flame retardants into our homes and into our bodies, and the chemicals don't even work as promised. It won all these awards, and the governor of California, it was a California law that was responsible, but all of North America and Canada followed it. So all the furniture, if you look at your couch, it will have a label, even if you don't live in California, that says it meets the California standard. And until 2013, that meant 5% of the weight of the foam was one of these toxic flame retardants. But we dreamed up a way with the governor to change this, and if you go to the store now, it will have a label and it will say whether or not it has flame retardants, and basically there are not flame retardants being put into furniture produced in America. China, it's a bit different, but you can find out. You can look for that label. It's legally required in California, but you'll find it everywhere. And basically, the foam industry in America is not using any more flame retardants, so this is a big deal. I don't have time to talk about bisphenols and phthalates. You can learn about our website, organic solvents, certain metals. But what we say is, do we really need this function? Is it worth the potential for harm? I wrote an article tackling toxics in science recently. I have some copies if anyone wants to see it, talking about this. And so I just want to end by saying we send out newsletters once a month about toxic chemicals, and 4 times a year more about mountain climbing and toxic chemicals. So I hope some of you will join either or both. We have sign-up sheets at our table, and I really want to try to bring this message to the medical profession. And just to say, because we're launching our statement on antimicrobials on May 1st, we would love to find some physician spokespeople who are interested in the subject of antimicrobials, who might want to talk to the press. When I said I was talking to you, somebody said, find us some doctors who can talk to the press. So if anybody knows about antimicrobials, and we our statement has pages of references, it's very sound science. So we're trying class by class, and we've done really well with flame retardants. We're working on the fluorinated, and now we're starting the antimicrobials. So we think the medical profession can really have a role in this, and I thank you for giving me this opportunity to share.